This is a continuation of the Zentangle process. As you can see, I've completely covered the entire sheet. With the patterns, and the patterns are from the top what I call the herringbone. The next level down has some stars with circles. Next level down is some curlicue lines. Then these sort of half circles, almost like feathers with a center part. Then this one was really fun. It's a bunch of pencils laid next to each other. And then lastly, a bunch of leaf patterns. So I'm actually going to finish up doing the leaf pattern because I just noticed that I didn't finish it all. Because what I wanted to do was, I have the leaves, but now I'm going to go in and put lines in between to distinguish the leaves from the background. So this makes the pattern even more dense than it was before. And then when I do the next step, I'm going to fill in those shapes with different colors to make the leaves stand out even more. So I'm almost done with this. And again, this is a ballpoint pen, a red ballpoint pen, gone over the top of a drawing that I did that I'm having all my students do. And I'm pressing down pretty hard. I'm not super concerned with going over the edge here. If you are concerned with that, just put another piece of paper so that when you go over it, it doesn't go on the drawing. But as I said, I'm not super concerned with this because I plan on framing this right up to the edge of the paper. Or excuse me, right up to the edge of the drawing. One other feature that I almost mentioned last time when I started this was I did an extra sort of a design technique when I created these patterns, and I'll show you what that design is in just a moment as soon as I'm done with these. Just a last minute check before I start coloring. So the design that I did, and I mentioned this to my students as I did it, in order for the waves to look like waves, I've left the top part of the wave empty. So it almost looks like a highlight across the top of the wave here. When I do the final and I start coloring it in, I'll probably leave those light or even use a lighter blue. So now I'm ready to start coloring. I've already sharpened a bunch of pencils. I'm going to carefully lift the tape off of here. It's not a super big problem if the tape rips the paper or pulls the top layer of the paper off, because as I said, I'm going to frame it right up to the edge of the drawing. One thing I neglected to mention when we were adding the drawing to the top of the paper is a method of making the tape semi-tacky, meaning not to make it so sticky, is to put it on your pant leg or on an oily surface like your hand and just put it on and take it off a couple of times. You could also, after you do that, you can put it on another piece of paper and take it off. And what it does, if you can't tell, I'm going to put it on my jeans so that you can see it. You don't want to do it too much because you want to keep some of the tackiness on there. But what happens is the tape picks up some of the lint from your clothing, and that makes the tape semi-tacky so that you can pull it up later without much issue. Now this in itself is actually kind of a cool pattern too. So in essence, I've already done or completed a Zentangle drawing, but this isn't my final. My final, which I've already actually started, looks like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start going over, and if you can see the drawing as you go, it's kind of difficult to see with this angle. But because of the different characteristics of this, like this large bubble right here, and some of the smaller bubbles, as much as possible, I'm going to either try to avoid them altogether or go a little bit softer over them. So in this case, I'm going around the jellyfish. Not totally necessary to go around the jellyfish, I just think it'll be a fun differentiation as I do this. And I'm just going to go lightly over the whole thing first, just where the water part of the drawing is. And again, I'm not super concerned with going above the lines here where the Zentangle pattern ends, because I'm going to frame it right up to the edge there. I'm going to go lightly over the whole surface around the jellyfish and the jellyfish's tentacles, just so that I can get a feel for where everything is. You can sort of see the waves coming in. So now you can start to see the background pattern. I've purposely left the lights low in the room so that you can see the light coming from this direction, which is the windows in the opposite direction, so that you can sort of see the pattern here. And again, I'm just going over and sort of trying to avoid just the tentacles. And that blows it out, but at least it lets me see the tentacles a little bit better. So I'm just going to go over quickly over just the area where the water is. And again, it doesn't matter what direction you go in, because it's all where the jellyfish and the tentacles are that I'm mostly concerned with. And if I miss an area, it's not a big deal, because I can go in later and add color to the top of it like I did over here to further differentiate or define the shapes. So I'm leaving a little bit of the highlight here on the wave. The areas of the bubble, because I didn't do a pattern inside the bubble, it's actually a little bit darker. If I wanted to go over this same pattern again, I could do it and then just leave, instead of doing a red pen, I would use a black pen or a blue pen, whatever other color I want to use, in case I wanted to use that same pattern and those same designs again, or those same patterns again. So again, I'm just very sort of carefully, but not too terribly carefully, going over everything, leaving a little bit at the top of the waves without a pattern in them, or without color in them. And it's kind of nice to have my other drawing next to it so that I can see where something may or may not be. I wasn't sure what this area was, but with my drawing close by, I can very quickly see that that's a tentacle that comes down here. So now I'm into the third wave, which has these feather-looking shapes. And I just noticed this area right here does not have a pattern in it. Now here's an interesting technique. if you have to replace or draw over a certain area, this is the way animators line up their drawings. I'm just looking at both drawings and very quickly flipping the paper up and down to see where the edge of the line is, because there's an area right in, let's see if I can find it again. Oh, no, I've lost it. Oh, right here. There's an area right here that doesn't have patterns in it. So again, I'm going to very quickly lift up and drop this, align it. Not super critical, wouldn't totally ruin the drawing if I left it this way, but I like to be as complete as possible, so I'm going to go ahead and put a pattern in here. Just simplify it a bit, and then I can continue on with my coloring. Just using the side of the pencil to get as much color on there as quickly as possible. Not being super careful, staying away from the tentacles, but as careful as I'm able. I'm also noticing that I'm missing part of the wave, so I'm actually just going to go ahead and color over the wave too, because that part is actually smooth, and when I darken the color or use a darker blue to do the top of the wave, I'll concern myself later with making it look better. The other thing about it is that most jellyfish have translucent tentacles. Some of them are transparent. So I'm not overly concerned with whether or not I cover up a tentacle when I'm coloring at this point. Still trying to be as careful as possible, but I'm not going to be overly concerned with that because I just want to get through this so that I can have an example for my students on Monday, which is tomorrow actually. Yes, I'm doing this on a Sunday. One of the blessings of where I work is that it's also where I go to church. Our church has been renting the Performing Arts Center at our school for the past several months. So, kind of a cool deal. I get to go to church and work at the same place. Some people might not think that's cool, but I think it's awesome. So again, just loosely defining this, not being overly cautious. You can see the patterns, kind of the effect of the patterns is starting to take shape. And this is the jellyfish on the bottom right corner. It's actually two jellyfish, but it's sort of a Siamese jellyfish because the tentacles are all attached to both. And I did that on purpose, just to make it fun for the kids and interesting for the pattern. So this first light blue color is really just sort of a setting the stage for going in later and adding details. So it looks like I've got all of the background done. Just going to make sure I got all the edges. Now, just to make it interesting, I think that rather than going with the darker blue immediately, Kind of like the way this red looks over here. So I'm going to go right into the red after I maybe take some time and go around the tentacles with a little bit lighter, darker blue, excuse me. One of the things that I'm trying to get my students to understand is to not necessarily, a few of them did this before I had a chance to correct them or suggest to them how to handle this, but one of the things that I'm hoping they avoid is actually drawing the tentacles or shading the tentacles in such a way as to be obviously where the lines are. I would really rather that the negative space of the tentacles, excuse me, the negative space of the patterns help to define the tentacles as opposed to going over and attempting to draw the tentacles. Now, I have explained to my students, and I will say it here or reiterate it here, the fun thing about this as far as I'm concerned is that there's really no wrong way to do it. As long as the patterns are etched in with the ballpoint pen, the way it is colored is not super critical. Some of my students may prove me wrong on that point, but that still remains to be seen. I literally just developed this technique over the course of the past few weeks. I developed it after hours, mostly at home, thinking it through and planning and plotting. But because I have what I would consider studio space here in my classroom, I do most of the physical work here. So, not sure what that means necessarily legally as to whether or not in a typical employer scenario the school would actually own any copyrights or patents. But I'm not going to worry about that. It's just a really cool process, procedure, and even though I developed it, they want to take credit for it. They can try and take credit for it. I really am not super concerned about that at this point. There may come a time, however, when I make $1 million off of this. Yeah, right. So again, I'm not being super concerned about where the colors are going. If they're going overlapping a little bit on the tentacles, I'm not going to concern myself with that. I'm just slowly building up the colors, and this is one of the key things that is probably the most difficult thing to teach students, and I would include adult students in this as well, because I do actually have an adult student, even though she probably wouldn't consider herself an adult student. One of the aides for our special needs kids has been coming in, and I challenged her a couple of weeks ago to, rather than just sitting and observing and correcting behavior, I almost teased her into picking up a pencil and trying to do what the kids are doing. The funny or ironic thing about it is she's, as an adult, of course, she has the control, number one, but as an adult, she's getting into it a lot more than the kids are. So it's kind of for me, it's sort of a affirmation, if you will, that this could be something that might turn into a fad. Now, having said that, she's not doing this particular project yet. She's doing the normal Zentangle pattern that looks something like this one, where she's gone through and done this diagram or this pattern, and she's putting Zentangle patterns inside of patterns. So this is sort of the grid, the loose, wavy grid that a lot of the students did to practice, and then there are other patterns inside the different areas in sort of a checkerboard. And I'll make sure to scan that later and include it in any of the documentation or samples. as this continues to progress. One of the other cool things about this process and about my teaching at this school that is just becoming more and more of a benefit all the time as far as I'm concerned is that I kind of get to explore art again. I've mentioned this before in my quote-unquote debriefings that I do from time to time. One of the beauties that I never really considered back when I was a professional graphic designer, graphic artist, project manager, whatever, one of the things I never had the chance to do was to really explore some of the art that I was creating. So I did a lot of Photoshop work, but I wasn't really experimenting and playing around with stuff. I have to give kudos to Frank Mutaccio for one technique that he taught me in Photoshop that I use all the time, and in fact will be teaching my 6th graders this week as we go from this fine art project in room 503 into the digital art classroom or the multimedia design classroom in room 501. And that is the use of layer masks. We just finished in the multimedia design class. The students just finished a magazine layout, a magazine cover layout, using clipping masks in Adobe Illustrator, which are very similar to layer masks in Photoshop, but not exactly. They end up doing the same thing, but just in a different way, and not as tight as Adobe Illustrator. Adobe Illustrator does a lot tighter than Photoshop does, at least the way that I was taught and the way I taught my students. So this is pretty much laying down the foundation. I'm trying to leave and beginning to start thinking about some of the other areas. I can see where I went over a tentacle here with the color here. But I'm starting to think about where I can start adding darker colors. And I'm using less of the side of the pencil in the detail areas so that I can get a little bit sharper area without actually drawing the line to define the jellyfish. And again, just like much of the other Zentangle and coloring book fad right now, this is actually quite meditative or contemplative, or whatever the right word is, contemplative. I could see where, if this were a product or a process that we're taught, technique that we're taught, I can see where this would have about the same value as doing the Zentangle in the first place. And that is one of the main purposes for Zentangle, for those folks who have really gotten into it in the last couple of years. And the coloring book craze tied in with Zentangle really just exemplifies the need for adults to relax in a non-digital way. And to me, that's one of the other greater benefits. And that is to get away from the computer and focus on doing art again. For me, at least, that's significant. One thing, if you'll notice, I'm doing here, I'll zoom in a bit so you can see, even though this isn't part of the background, this is where I'm choosing to make the tentacle look like it's overlapping the tentacle behind it. It was done in the drawing this way, and actually now that I see it, I did it the opposite way. So technically, this is where I should have shaded here, but instead I changed it up and shaded it that way. Not the end of the world. I'm not going to worry about it, not going to concern myself with it, but I am going to reference a little more often where those shadows should go. So it's where it's overlapping. And also this fold, I created sort of a stylistic thing here that I do when I do some of my graffiti type drawings. I like doing this overlap motif that you can't really see because I wasn't out focused or zoomed out. This is what I'm talking about here. Some of these lines, the way they overlap, I like to do my lettering. I do want to try and keep it a little bit closer to the original because the lines that are there overlapping will allow it to be emphasized that that's what is there. Nice thing about working with colored pencils is I can go over it, stop it, mess with another color, and then come back to it later because of the way they blend. So I'm just very loosely going in, adding some of these details, not, again, super concerned with coloring within the lines, as it were. And to me, that's one of the coolest things about this, and I mentioned this in one of my notes the other day. This is coloring without concern for staying in the lines, because I'm just coloring shapes and really just very loosely going over the outside of the design where the pattern is, or the outside of the tentacles in this case where the patterns are. The other beauty of this, in my thinking, is that even though I drew this original drawing and would probably post it somewhere along with the technique, maybe this will be my first online lesson plan. I have to figure out that deal where they speed up the video so that you can get through all of these details quickly without having to listen to my banter. So that's kind of the basis of it. You can see the let's turn off the light. So now you can see the details. With the embossed area, this close-up view is starting to look a lot like an actual intaglio print, which is kind of cool. One of those things that is causing me to consider whether or not an additional degree in printmaking might not be in order. One of the benefits, one of the cool things about being a teacher, this is one of the few industries where continuing my education actually pays off in a very substantial way. And even though taking classes as a young teacher is not necessarily financially doable for a lot of people, because of the benefit of being able to use units for salary advancement. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's every 15 units or so, which is about, on the level that I take it, that's like 3 or 4 years for every 15 units. So had I become a teacher years ago, and any new teachers, if you're watching or whatever, listening, unless you turned the sound off on me, strongly suggest doing that. Continue your education. It will help you be a better teacher, and it will also help to fund and to increase your salary. I know that the teachers who have been in my corner for a number of years in my professional teaching career, which has not been many, by the way, the age in my voice ought to be obvious because I'm not a young man anymore. I actually became a teacher in my 40s, or began going into the teaching realm, the teaching field in my 40s. Didn't actually become a teacher until I had turned 50. After being in the graphics industry for 20 years, I went back to school and got my teaching credential, substituted for a couple years, as is the norm for teachers, something that all teachers should expect for the first couple of years of their professional career. And then got my first full-time job, worked for 2 years on contract, and then got laid off. Kind of one of the other natures of the beast, I guess. But now I'm back working full-time, and it looks as though this could be a full-time permanent gig for me. So I am thankful and blessed, and as I said, one of the coolest things about it is I was a fine arts major in college, but then decided right before I finished my college years, I decided to get married, didn't finish my degree, was married for 8 years, got divorced, and then 2 years later I finished my degree. So I got my bachelor's degree. I didn't get my bachelor's degree until 10 years after I should have, 12 years after I should have. Should have gotten my bachelor's degree in 1983, but I ended up getting it in 1995. Thanks to some poor advice. In any event, that's neither here nor there. This is actually shaping up pretty well. So I'm going to start adding some red in here. Actually, you know what? I think instead of the red, I'm going to do the green. So you can't really see it because of the light. For some reason, the light works better in low light. So the pattern I did down below at the very bottom is sort of a leaf pattern. I guess it could have been seaweed, kelp, but I'm just going to go in and start playing around with some of this. One of the other things that I mention to my students all the time that I may not have said here yet is that if you don't want to smudge your drawing, put another piece of paper down. So I'm going to leave the blue around the outside of the leaves, and then I'm doing a heavier line on the edge and where the center is, and leaving them sort of translucent with the blue in the background. So that I get this, it's a pattern, but with the heavy embossing, and again, the heavier you push without pushing through the paper, the better. It's kind of funny, one of my students the other day, and I hear this all the time from students, so I have come up with a standard retort. One of my students the other day, who was frustrated with the process and wasn't getting the results she wanted, he said, "Mr. Wing, how about if we just trade? Can't I just have yours?" I said, "Sure, I'll sell it to you." And she said, "Oh, okay, I'll give you 50 cents. I said, "No, the cost is $600. "What? $600 for what?" I said, "Well, most artists figure out the amount of their, or the value of their piece based on an hourly rate, and also then multiplying it by however long it took them to do it. So far, I would have to guesstimate that I've got about, gosh, conservatively I've got about 8 or 10 hours into this so far. Everything from the original drawing to the embossed drawing. The original drawing took me maybe 2 hours. because I drew it a couple of times, inked it, photocopied it, and then redrew it on here. And now I'm technically redrawing it a third time. And someone might say, you know, maybe you should think about intaglio printmaking or stone lithography or something like that. And as I intimated a couple of minutes ago, that is a real distinct possibility in my thinking. I did really like the printmaking class I had in college back in 1982 or 83. I can't remember which one it was, probably 82. And that was something that I would have considered because I love drawing. But the nice thing, obviously, about printmaking is you draw it one time, either on metal or stone, and then you print it off a bunch of times. And just like this process, I could change the type of print or the colors on the print and then have a completely different, each print could be unique. So I may just talk myself into doing that at some point. In the meantime, this process actually has me kind of excited. I haven't been excited about something in a while. And so this process of creating this new art form, and it may not be new, but it's new to me. I've never did anything like this, never seen anything like this. Being a one of a kind at this point. Anybody wants it? It's yours for $600. So rather than continuing to bore you with my banter, I'm going to turn off the camera here and process this piece, this video.